What if everything you learned about human evolution was incomplete? Not wrong, exactly, but missing the most crucial chapter of our story. Right now, as you listen to these words, your DNA carries a genetic signature that shouldn't exist according to traditional evolutionary theory. A single gene, altered with surgical precision that transformed primitive hominids into the dominant species on Earth almost overnight in evolutionary terms. This isn't science fiction. It's documented in peer-reviewed genetic studies from institutions like the Max Planck Institute. But here's where it gets disturbing. That same genetic modification appears in ancient texts from around the world, saying humanity was created by beings who came from the sky. Today, we're going deep into the archaeological and genetic evidence that suggests human civilization didn't slowly evolve over hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, something dramatically accelerated our development exactly when ancient texts say it did. We're going to examine the physical proof, the DNA evidence, the archaeological anomalies that mainstream science struggles to explain. And by the end, you'll understand why the gap in human development isn't just puzzling, it's impossible without intervention. This is the story of how slaves became gods, and it's far more documented than you might think. Let's start with a problem that anthropologists don't like discussing at dinner parties. Homo sapiens, our species, first appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. For the next 250,000 years, we did essentially nothing remarkable. We made simple stone tools, we lived in small groups, we survived. But we didn't innovate, we didn't create art, we didn't build cities or develop agriculture or invent writing. For 250,000 years, we were just another primate species trying not to get eaten. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Within the span of just a few thousand years, a geological blink of an eye, humans suddenly exploded with creativity and innovation. We developed sophisticated language, created stunning cave art, invented new hunting technologies, established trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, and began the cultural evolution that would eventually lead to smartphones and space travel. Anthropologists call this the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and they have dozens of theories about what caused it. But here's where makes those theories problematic. We didn't get smarter in terms of brain size. Neanderthals, who we coexisted with for tens of thousands of years, had brains the same size as ours. In some cases, their brains were actually larger. They were also significantly stronger than us, better adapted to the harsh Ice Age climate, and they'd been successfully surviving in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before we showed up. By every measure of evolutionary fitness, Neanderthals should have dominated Homo sapiens. Instead, within 15,000 years of our cognitive explosion, Neanderthals were extinct and we had spread to every corner of the globe. The traditional explanation is that we developed better social cooperation, more sophisticated communication, superior abstract thinking. But that explanation creates another problem. If those advantages came from gradual evolution, we should see a slow, steady improvement in human capabilities over hundreds of thousands of years. We don't. We see near stagnation for 250,000 years, then sudden explosive advancement. It's as if someone flipped a switch in the human brain. In 2020, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Cell Biology and Genetics published findings that might explain exactly what that switch was. They identified a specific gene called TKTL1 that controls the production of neurons in the developing brain. Modern humans have a version of this gene that differs from all other hominid species by exactly one amino acid. Just one tiny change in the genetic code. But that single change causes the human brain to produce neurons at a dramatically faster rate than any other primate. It's not about brain size, it's about neural density and processing power. Here's where it gets interesting. The researchers found that Neanderthals also had the TKTL1 gene, but their version differed from ours by that crucial single amino acid. When they introduced the human version of the gene into mouse and ferret models, the animals developed significantly larger and more complex neocortices. The genetic difference between dominating the planet and going extinct came down to a single, precise alteration in one gene. This level of specificity doesn't happen through random mutation and natural selection. When we see this kind of surgical precision in genetic modification, we're looking at deliberate engineering. Now, you might think this is just coincidence, that evolution sometimes makes precise jumps. Except we have another problem. The gene that makes us human, that gives us our unique cognitive abilities, appears to have been modified exactly when ancient texts from around the world say humanity was created by beings who came from the sky.
Every major civilization on Earth has a creation story, and they're all remarkably similar in their core elements. The details change, the names of the gods vary, but the fundamental narrative remains consistent. Powerful beings from above take clay or earth, mix it with something divine, their blood or tears or breath, and create humanity in their own image, but smaller, weaker, designed to serve. The oldest written version we have comes from ancient Sumer, the world's first major civilization, which emerged in Mesopotamia around 7,000 years ago. The Sumerians didn't just have oral traditions about creation, they wrote everything down on clay tablets in cuneiform script, and thousands of these tablets have survived. They tell a detailed story about beings called the Anunnaki who came to Earth from the heavens, needed laborers to work in mines extracting gold, and engineered a worker species by mixing their own genetic material with that of primitive hominids already living on Earth. The creation account describes multiple failed attempts, producing monsters and deformed creatures before they perfected the process. The first successful human was called Adamu, which in ancient Sumerian means one from the earth or first man. This wasn't a metaphor in their texts. It was described as a deliberate act of genetic engineering, mixing the blood of the gods with the clay of the earth. Blood contains DNA. Clay was their word for existing life on the planet. Now travel 4,000 miles west to ancient Egypt. Their creation mythology describes the god Khnum fashioning humanity on a potter's wheel, mixing the tears of gods with the clay of the Nile. Same basic story, different cultural framework. The divine essence combined with earthly material to create humans. Cross the Atlantic to the Americas. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes the gods making multiple attempts to create humans, first from mud, then from wood, finally succeeding when they mixed maize with the blood of the gods. Again, the pattern repeats. Divine genetic material plus existing earthly life equals humanity. The Hebrew creation account in Genesis follows the identical pattern. God creates Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes life into him. The word Adam in Hebrew shares linguistic roots with the Sumerian Adamu, both meaning first man or one from the earth. Eve is created from Adam's genetic material, described poetically as a rib to enable human reproduction. They're placed in a garden called Eden, which in Sumerian texts is described as a specific location in Mesopotamia where the gods kept their genetically engineered humans before allowing them to spread. But here's what makes this more than mythology. The genetic evidence shows that modern humans did receive a sudden, precise genetic modification that can't be explained by gradual evolution. The archaeological evidence shows that human civilization exploded in complexity exactly when these texts say creation occurred. And we're finding physical evidence that the beings described in these texts might have actually existed. In 1927, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, one of the world's first great cities, when he discovered something extraordinary. He found the tomb of Queen Puabi, who ruled during Ur's first dynasty over 4,000 years ago. When they examined her remains, they discovered her skull was dramatically larger than normal humans, significantly elongated, and structured differently from any known human population. Queen Puabi's tomb dates her to the earliest period of Sumerian civilization, right when the ancient texts describe the Anunnaki interbreeding with humans to create a hybrid ruling class. Her skull morphology matches the descriptions of the Anunnaki perfectly. Large, elongated cranial structure, significant cranial capacity exceeding modern humans. The obvious question is whether she was one of these hybrids. The answer should be simple. Extract DNA from her remains and analyze it. But here's where things get political. Despite numerous requests from geneticists, access to Queen Puabi's DNA has been repeatedly denied by authorities who control the artifacts. The official reason is preservation concerns, but geneticists can now extract and sequence DNA from samples so small they don't damage the specimen. Something else is preventing that analysis. Queen Puabi isn't unique. Elongated skulls have been discovered on every inhabited continent. The largest collection was found in Paracas, Peru, with over 300 skulls exhibiting dramatic cranial elongation. The mainstream explanation is artificial cranial deformation, a practice where infant skulls are deliberately shaped using boards and bindings. This practice did exist in many ancient cultures. However, the Paracas skulls present problems that artificial deformation can't explain. First, artificially deformed skulls have the same cranial volume as normal skulls. The shape changes, but the internal space remains constant. The Paracas skulls have cranial volumes 25 to 40% larger than modern humans. That's not reshaping, that's a fundamentally different cranial structure. Second, artificially deformed skulls show clear signs of the deformation process, including bone warping, pressure points, and asymmetry. Many of the Paracas skulls show none of these signs. They appear to have grown naturally into their elongated shape. Third, and most dramatically, some of the Paracas skulls have only 2 parietal plates instead of 3 that all modern humans have. You can't create that through external binding. That's a genetic difference in cranial development. In 2014, geneticist Breen Forrester, who has been studying the Paracas skulls for years, managed to extract DNA samples from several specimens and sent them to multiple laboratories for analysis. The results were unexpected enough that the labs initially thought the samples were contaminated. The DNA showed genetic markers that don't exist in indigenous South American populations. Instead, the closest genetic matches came from populations in the Middle East, and specifically Mesopotamia. The largest and most elongated skull in the collection, which also had the 2-plate cranial structure, showed genetic markers that simply don't appear in any known modern human population. The geneticists who analyzed it described the results as problematic because they suggest either a completely isolated population that somehow never mixed with any other human groups for thousands of years, or a non-human origin. Let's think about what that means. Skulls buried in Peru thousands of years ago containing DNA from Mesopotamia during a time when mainstream archaeology insists there was no transoceanic contact. Skulls with cranial structures that don't match any known human population. Skulls that match perfectly with ancient descriptions of hybrid beings created by the sky gods. This isn't proof of ancient astronauts, but it's certainly evidence that demands explanation beyond standard historical narratives. The physical evidence extends beyond unusual remains. Ancient Sumer, the culture that provided the most detailed written accounts of the Anunnaki, was for centuries considered legendary. Many historians believed the Sumerian civilization described in tablets was exaggerated or entirely mythological. Then archaeologists started finding the cities. Eridu, the first city mentioned in Sumerian texts as being built by the Anunnaki, was discovered exactly where the texts said it would be. Another major Sumerian city, was found with its massive ziggurats still partially intact. These weren't primitive settlements. These were sophisticated urban centers with complex water systems, monumental architecture, established legal codes, mathematical systems, astronomical observations, and extensive written records. They appeared seemingly overnight in archaeological terms, with no evidence of gradual development from simpler societies. It's as if someone designed and built an advanced civilization from scratch, which is exactly what the Sumerian texts claim happened. The Anunnaki gave humans the knowledge needed to build and maintain civilization.
Let's return to that modified gene, TKTTL1, because the implications extend beyond just making us smarter. When geneticists map human evolution through DNA analysis, they're looking for specific markers that indicate when populations split, mixed, and evolved. The human genetic story should show gradual changes accumulating over hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, geneticists have identified several dramatic genetic events that happened relatively recently and can't be fully explained by standard evolutionary processes. Around 70,000 years ago, the human population crashed to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals in a genetic bottleneck so severe it should have driven us extinct. We call this the Toba catastrophe, named after a massive volcanic eruption that may have caused a volcanic winter lasting years. The genetic evidence shows we barely survived. Then, within a few thousand years of nearly going extinct, we suddenly developed all those advanced cognitive abilities, sophisticated language, symbolic thinking, and began our rapid spread across the globe. Something happened during or immediately after that genetic bottleneck that fundamentally changed humanity. The traditional explanation is that the small population size created conditions for rapid evolution through genetic drift. But genetic drift is random. It doesn't produce the kind of precise, beneficial modifications we see in genes like TKTTL1. Random mutation and natural selection favor beneficial changes slowly over many generations, with lots of dead ends and failed experiments along the way. What we see in the human genome is more like targeted modification, specific genes altered to produce specific beneficial results. Consider our chromosome structure. Great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs. That's not a trivial difference. At some point in our ancestry, two chromosomes fused together, and this fusion is visible in our DNA as chromosome 2, which contains the markers showing it was formed from two separate chromosomes. The fusion includes telomeres, the end caps of chromosomes in the middle of our chromosome 2, along with traces of what used to be two separate centromeres. Standard evolutionary theory says this fusion happened randomly and somehow didn't cause problems, so it spread through the population. But chromosomal fusion events are usually catastrophic. They typically result in infertility, developmental abnormalities, or death. The odds of a random chromosomal fusion being not just non-harmful, but actually successful enough to spread through an entire species are extraordinarily low. Yet it happened to our ancestors at some point after we split from the chimpanzee lineage. Why? We don't know. But if you wanted to genetically modify a primate species to be more compatible with your own genetic material, forcing a chromosomal fusion to make the numbers match would be a logical step. Let's talk about junk DNA, a term geneticists now admit was premature. For decades, scientists called the vast stretches of non-coding DNA in our genome junk because it didn't seem to do anything.
About 98% of human DNA doesn't code for proteins, so early geneticists assumed it was evolutionary baggage, leftover scraps from our evolutionary past serving no function. They were wrong. We now know that much of this non-coding DNA serves regulatory functions, controlling when and how genes are expressed. Some of it appears to be involved in immune system function. Some sections are still mysterious. But here's something interesting. Some sections of non-coding DNA contain sequences that look suspiciously like genetic engineering signatures. Regular patterns, repeated sequences, markers that in modern genetic engineering we would use to identify insertion points or to mark modified sections. Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, became convinced later in his life that DNA was too complex to have originated naturally on Earth in the time available. He proposed directed panspermia, the idea that life was deliberately seeded on Earth by an advanced civilization. While that theory has its own problems, Crick was responding to the mathematical improbability of DNA's complexity arising through random chemical processes in just a few 100 million years. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs encoding around 20,000 genes. But it's not just the number of genes that matters, it's how they're organized, how they interact, how they're regulated. The human genome is functionally an incredibly sophisticated programming language, far more complex than any computer code we've written. And like any sophisticated program, it shows signs of design, modularity, reusable components, error-checking systems, and yes, sections that look like comments or annotations that programmers use to mark their code. Now, I'm not claiming that every mysterious section of human DNA is a signature left by ancient genetic engineers, but the pattern we're seeing, sudden, precise, beneficial modifications, genetic changes that statistically shouldn't work but do, and a genome that's far more complex and organized than random evolution typically produces, all of this fits better with the intervention hypothesis than the pure random evolution hypothesis. There's another genetic mystery that rarely gets discussed. Modern humans are the only hominin species that survived. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, a dozen other human-like species that once thrived across Africa, Europe, and Asia, all went extinct. Some went extinct before we arrived in their territories. Others disappeared shortly after we showed up. The standard explanation is that we outcompeted them through superior intelligence and social organization. But genetic evidence tells a more complex story. We know now that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals because most people of European and Asian descent carry some Neanderthal DNA, usually between 1 and 4%. We also interbred with Denisovans, and people of Southeast Asian and Pacific Island descent carry some Denisovan DNA. So we didn't just eliminate these species through competition, we absorbed them through interbreeding. But here's the puzzle. The amount of archaic DNA in modern humans is relatively small and seems to have been selected against over time. In other words, evolution has been slowly removing Neanderthal and Denisovan genes from our genome because they're slightly disadvantageous. Why would that be if we successfully interbred? The most likely explanation is that our genetics and theirs were compatible enough for reproduction, but different enough that the hybrid offspring had lower fitness. That level of genetic distance typically indicates species that have been separated for a very long time, or species that have undergone different evolutionary pressures. Or, if you follow the intervention hypothesis, it suggests that one of these species was modified while the others weren't, creating a genetic mismatch.
All of this brings us back to the central mystery. Why did human civilization suddenly explode in complexity around 7,000 years ago? We had been anatomically modern for 300,000 years. We had our enhanced cognitive abilities for at least 50,000 years. We had survived the Toba catastrophe, spread across the globe, and started developing basic agriculture around 12,000 years ago. Then, we plateau. Small farming villages emerged, basic pottery, simple tools, but no writing, no mathematics, no cities, no monumental architecture. Then, in Mesopotamia, seemingly overnight, we get Sumer, complete with sophisticated writing systems, complex mathematics, advanced astronomy, massive architectural projects, organized government, legal codes, literature, including the first written epic, medical knowledge, metallurgy, and detailed records of everything. The jump from Neolithic farming villages to Sumerian civilization is so dramatic that archaeologists struggled for decades to explain it. Where did all this knowledge come from? The Sumerians themselves tell us. They said the gods taught them everything. The Anunnaki descended from the heavens and gave humans the gift of civilization. Now, you can interpret that as mythology, as a primitive culture trying to explain their own achievements by attributing them to gods. That's the mainstream view. But what if they meant it literally? What if there was intervention, not necessarily by beings from another planet, but by whoever or whatever modified that TKTL1 gene and gave humans our enhanced cognitive abilities? What if the same entities that conducted the genetic engineering also provided the knowledge jumpstart that turned scattered tribal groups into civilization? The evidence doesn't prove ancient astronaut theory or genetic engineering by aliens or any specific intervention hypothesis, but the evidence does show that standard evolutionary and historical narratives have significant gaps they struggle to explain. A single gene modified with surgical precision exactly when it needed to be. Physical remains of individuals with non-standard cranial structures and out-of-place genetic markers. Ancient cities appearing with advanced knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop, and consistent global narratives describing creation by beings from above through mixing divine essence with earthly material. You're left with two possibilities. Either we're looking at the most remarkable series of coincidences in human history, or something happened in our past that the ancient texts describe with surprising accuracy. They tell us we were created through genetic engineering to serve as workers, that we were given intelligence and then abandoned or rebelled, that we built civilization with the help of our creators before they departed or withdrew, and that all of this happened in the relatively recent past, within the window of human history. The academic establishment will continue to favor gradualism and standard evolutionary theory because that's what the current paradigm allows. But science advances when we examine anomalies rather than dismissing them. The genetic evidence, the archaeological evidence, the consistent global narratives, the unexplained jumps in human capability, all of these anomalies point towards something more complex than the simple story we've been told. Whether that something was ancient genetic engineering or some other form of intervention, the evidence suggests that human development wasn't natural. It was assisted, guided, modified by something or someone with the knowledge and technology to turn primitive primates into the dominant species on the planet. And perhaps most importantly, whatever modified us and taught us civilization, the effects of those modifications are still active in every cell of your body right now. That enhanced neuron production from TKTL1, it's not just history. It's happening in every developing human brain, giving us capabilities no other species possesses. We're still living in the world that intervention created, still using the knowledge those ancient teachers provided, still trying to understand who we really are and where we truly came from. The answers might not be what we expected, but they're written in our genes, carved in ancient stone, and preserved in stories older than recorded history. Maybe it's time we started taking those stories seriously.